Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've had a varied career, and back in the 1980s, I was a spokesman for the veterinary half of the Agriculture Department. During that time, the Bureau of Animal Industry, which was the forerunner to my division, celebrated its 100th birthday. I was asked to write a narration. I had a good friend, the late Larry Lumen, record it. It was issued to radio stations. I just found it the other day, and I thought it might be fun to put slides to it, which I should have done originally. So here, from the 1980s, a little late, is my slide presentation of the history of veterinary medicine at the Agriculture Department.
The BAI's first director was Dr. Daniel Salmon, an energetic, progressive veterinarian who had studied in Europe. Salmonella would be named for him. Salmon told Congress he would need authority, manpower, and money. Soon, Congress gave him the authority to quarantine premises and stop shipment of cattle to halt disease. The BAI was authorized to pay for the destruction of diseased animals. The agency was soon coordinating efforts that had once been entrusted to such diverse groups as the Army Veterinary Corps, the Patent Office, and the U.S. Treasury Department. BAI research scientists began to enlist the aid of the states. Pennsylvania took on a 3-year study of animal health. Poultry were tested in Maine, beef cattle in Alabama, horses in Colorado, sheep in Wyoming, dairy herds in Michigan. On September 26, 1892, barely 3,000 days since the Bureau of Animal Industry had been born, our first assignment was completed. Contagious bovine pleuropneumonia had been eradicated. One disease down, and many more to go. BAI researchers were bringing scientific methods to agriculture. In the 1880s, Cooper Curtis, Theobald Smith, and Fred Kilbourne proved that ticks spread Texas fever in cattle, leading to a program of dipping cattle. BAI discoveries about the spread of disease by insects had important implications for human medicine, leading to the control of yellow fever and malaria, making it possible for U.S. workmen to complete the Panama Canal, where 2 attempts by the French had failed before. It was 1902. We had turned the corner into a new century. The BAI soon came face to face with the most devastating livestock disease of all, foot and mouth disease, FMD. 6 outbreaks would have to be wiped out before it was eradicated for the last time in 1929. The largest outbreak in 1914 spread through the Chicago stockyards and other major markets. Nearly 750,000 head of livestock were lost in the outbreak. The following year, Congress passed tough legislation prohibiting direct imports of animals and most animal products from countries with foot and mouth. We have remained free of foot and mouth ever since. In 1903, BAI researcher Marion Dorset isolated the virus that caused hog cholera, leading to the development of a serum 3 years later. The reckless production of this serum and other vaccines, often by fly-by-night companies, brought a cry for regulation of such products. The Virus Serum Toxin Act of 1913 was the result, requiring all products used on livestock and pets be safe and effective. In 1905, American author Upton Sinclair published his classic novel, The Jungle, a scathing condemnation of the filthy conditions in meatpacking plants. Public opinion soon mobilized legislation, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. BAI inspectors soon became common sights in slaughterhouses and processing plants. In 1910, the BAI began to move its livestock test operations from the mall in downtown Washington to an area about 20 miles outside of the nation's capital. At Beltsville, Maryland, nearly every segment of U.S. agriculture would eventually go under the microscope or into the test pens at Beltsville. Beltsville researchers began a project to improve the milk output of cows. Eventually, it would increase production fivefold. Other researchers helped improve the taste and shelf life of butter, giving the dairy industry much-needed support. In 1915, Beltsville researcher Sewell Wright opened up a new page in animal research when he launched a long-term study of animal breeding. Using guinea pigs, Wright observed genetic traits. His pioneering work in basic animal genetics led to dramatic improvements in domestic livestock, and the principles of population genetics he developed were adapted by animal scientists around the world. During World War I, Beltsville assisted the Army by improving the wool output of sheep, vitally important to both soldiers and consumers in a time before synthetic fibers. The familiar sight of the hunchback at the turn of the century was the result of cattle tuberculosis spreading to humans through infected milk. In the Roaring '20s, BAI veterinarians traveled the new highways of the nation. Much of their time was spent assisting the growing American swine industry. The Meteor hog was the result. Additional work would further improve U.S. hogs, leading to the leaner hog of today. In the mid-1930s, farmers and ranchers were singing the Depression blues, and then the Dust Bowl came. Using the drought as a catalyst, the BAI worked with farmers and ranchers to reduce their herds and minimize the incidence of brucellosis, a cattle disease that can also affect humans. In the mid-30s, grocery stores told the USDA that a new type of turkey was needed. At the time, the average bird weighed far too much for a single family meal. A decade later, the first Beltsville turkeys began showing up at stores. The new birds were much smaller, with a high percentage of breast meat. American housewives had another menu choice. The year was 1946. The war was over. But soon something would happen that would put the BAI back on a wartime footing. After months of faulty diagnosis, Mexico finally realized that foot and mouth disease was out of control among its livestock population. The border with Mexico was immediately sealed. BAI veterinarians and scientists rushed to Mexico to help. FMD was spreading at the rate of 500 square miles per day. Final eradication was announced in 1954. In the 1950s, Americans were building fallout shelters. The Cold War was heating up, and every science fiction movie pondered a future dominated by the reckless use of atomic energy. USDA scientists were anxious to try a peaceful use of the atom. Taking a concept first proposed by Dr. E.F. Knipling back in the 30s, USDA scientists set to work to rid the U.S. cattle industry of screwworm flies, which had caused losses in the South and Southwest, and human suffering as well. Knipling's idea was to raise millions of more flies, but then sterilize them and release them to mate with native females, breeding themselves out of existence. At the peak of the effort, 200 million sterile flies a week were being produced at an abandoned Air Force base at Mission, Texas, and released by air. By the 1970s, we would begin cooperating with Mexico to drive the fly further and further south. A factory the size of 3 football fields would be built in Mexico, capable of raising 500 million flies a week. At one time in this country, there were more than 100,000 cases a year. By 1982, there would be none. In the summer of 1952, USDA employees started heading for a tiny island off the tip of Long Island, New York. There, on Plum Island, a special disease lab was built to permit the testing of contagious foreign livestock diseases in total isolation. Major breakthroughs would be achieved at Plum Island, including a method to produce a vaccine for foot and mouth disease using gene splicing. The campaign to eradicate brucellosis in cattle gained new momentum in the 1950s with more funding. By the 1970s, the program would get an additional shot in the arm when an independent blue ribbon panel would publish its findings that brucellosis eradication was a legitimate, attainable goal, and that the tools for eradication were available. By the 1950s, the American poultry industry had grown by leaps and bounds. More than 3 billion chickens and turkeys a year were being served on U.S. tables. A system of poultry inspection was implemented. USDA inspectors became common sights at poultry processing plants. In 1961, we consolidated much of our domestic animal health research and diagnostic work into a brand new facility at Ames, Iowa. Research on diseases, diagnostic work, and the testing of vaccines and serums for use on livestock is carried on in the new facilities. In the mid-1960s, a rash of newspaper and magazine articles resulted in a public outcry for federal laws to protect animals used in laboratory experiments and to prevent pet napping. The Animal Welfare Act was the result. USDA inspectors would begin making unannounced visits at pet breeding facilities, research labs, airports, and even zoos and circuses to assure humane care of protected species. In the late 60s, the USDA announced the development of a vaccine to protect chickens from a type of cancer called Merrick's disease. Although not a threat to human health, Merrick's had long been a burden for American poultry raisers, causing $168 million in losses in the year before the vaccine became available. By the 1960s, advances in technology were making it possible to dream dreams that even Dr. Salmon would have thought impossible. Studies began into ways of transferring embryos to produce greater numbers of offspring. The possibility of predetermining the sex of livestock became a reality. Meat inspection scientists tackled the problem of chemical residues in meats. In 1979, following the urging of U.S. livestock breeders anxious to import new breeding stock from countries infected with foot and mouth disease, the USDA opened a special maximum security quarantine station on an offshore island near Key West, where animals are quarantined and undergo intensive testing for foot and mouth disease and a host of other foreign livestock diseases and pests. Imports from less threatening areas had been handled over the years at Clifton, New Jersey, from 1903 to 1980, and since 1980 at a new facility an hour north of New York City at Newburgh, New York. The USDA also maintains import stations at Honolulu and Miami. On January 31, 1978, the U.S. would be declared hog cholera-free, perhaps the most significant achievement in nearly a century of battling animal diseases. We learned a lot from that campaign, including the effectiveness of using task forces to combat diseases. In 1971, this approach was used successfully when a type of horse sleeping sickness was spread by mosquitoes in Texas. With the help of the Air Force, 13.5 million acres were sprayed for Venezuelan equine encephalitis. Nearly 3 million horses were vaccinated in 19 states. Later in 1971, a foreign poultry disease raced through California. Eradication of exotic Newcastle disease took 2.5 years. More than 12 million laying hens were lost. Today, 5 strategically located teams of experts are ready to travel on a moment's notice to set up new task force headquarters if any foreign animal disease should enter the U.S. 30,000 years ago, man spent most of his day in the quest for food. Today, our search is for a parking spot at the supermarket. A century ago, few nations wanted our animal exports. Today, we have the healthiest livestock in the world. The next century? Well, there will be other threats to livestock. The BAI won't be there, but hard-working men and women in its successor agencies will be, manning our ports of entry, watching at sale barns and slaughter plants, testing animals, peering into microscopes, informing the public, enforcing the law, working 24 hours a day into our second century of animal health.
The Ag Department had been founded during the Lincoln administration, but its focus was mainly plants and crops. In the 1880s, it got around to veterinary medicine, and formed the Bureau of Animal Industry. I'm Dennis Daly.